ground beneath Seattle has been keeping a secret. Not the kind scientists suspected, not the offshore monster fault everyone talks about, not the slow-building catastrophe that disaster documentaries love to dramatize. Something smaller, SEC, nothing closer, something that researchers at the United States Geological Survey just found evidence of rupturing as recently as the year 1833. That's not ancient history. That's just 18 years before the first American settlers built permanent structures in what would become one of the most economically powerful cities on the West Coast. The ground moved violently while people were standing on it, and nobody wrote it down. And for nearly 2 centuries after that event, the fault responsible for it sat completely unaccounted for in every federal model used to calculate earthquake risk in the United States. That's the story underneath the headlines. Not just that Seattle has an earthquake problem. Every geologist in the country already knew that. The real story is that the specific faults scientists were ignoring, the ones they considered too small to worry about, the ones that didn't make the cut for the national hazard model, have been firing on a timeline that is entirely relevant to human civilization. And right now, in 2026, a city of over 4 million people is sitting on top of them with building codes, insurance models, and emergency plans that don't fully account for what's underneath. Let's go through this carefully because the details matter enormously. Seattle sits inside the Puget Sound metropolitan region of Washington state. The population of the greater metro area is just over 4 million people. The city itself is home to around 750,000. It's the economic engine of the Pacific Northwest, a hub for technology, shipping, aerospace, and commerce. The Port of Seattle is among the busiest trade terminals in North America. Tech corridors stretch across Bellevue and Redmond to the east. The skyline rises above Elliott Bay and below the waterline. Below the roads and rail lines and decades of accumulated urban infrastructure, the Earth's crust is fractured in ways that scientists are still working to fully understand. Most residents of the region have heard about the Cascadia Subduction Zone. It's the big one in the popular imagination, an offshore fault system running from Northern California all the way up to British Columbia, capable of generating a magnitude 9 earthquake, and the kind of tsunami that would reshape the Pacific Northwest coastline within minutes. The last time it fully ruptured was on January 26, 1700. An event so powerful that the resulting tsunami crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and struck the coast of Japan, where it was recorded in historical documents. Japanese scholars later helped scientists work backward from the speed of the wave to calculate the exact moment of the quake on the other side of the ocean. That was 326 years ago. The average gap between Cascadia ruptures is somewhere between 300 and 600 years, which means the window is open right now and has been for some time. But here's something the disaster preparedness conversation rarely leads with. A major earthquake on the Seattle fault zone, the network of fractures running directly beneath the city, would very likely cause more immediate destruction in Seattle than a Cascadia megaquake. That conclusion doesn't come from an independent blogger or fringe academic. It comes from the lead researcher of a study published in the GSA Bulletin in January 2026, a USGS geologist named Dr. Stephen Angster, who has spent years literally digging into the ground around Seattle to read what the fault system has left behind. And what he found rewrote the hazard timeline in ways the city is still processing. Here's the background. The Seattle Fault Zone is an east-west trending network of fractures that extends roughly 75 kilometers from the Cascade foothills in the east all the way to Hood Canal on the Olympic Peninsula in the west. It cuts directly beneath downtown Seattle, beneath Paoni, or East Square with its century-old brick buildings, beneath the stadiums where major professional sports teams play, beneath the waterfront where millions of tourists photograph the Olympic mountains in the background. This is not a distant offshore threat. This is a fault system running under the actual city. Geologists began seriously investigating this fault zone in the early 1990s. And what they found first was evidence of a catastrophic ancient event. In approximately 923 CE, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake ruptured the main fault. The ground heaved. Shorelines along Puget Sound were thrust upward by as much as 8 meters in an instant, more than 26 feet of vertical displacement. Happening suddenly, without warning. Submarine landslides triggered by the shaking sent a local tsunami ripping through the inland waterway of Puget Sound. The geological fingerprints of this event are everywhere. Sandy tsunami deposits sit in sediment layers. Ancient Douglas fir trees, their trunks preserved at the bottoms of lakes, mark the moment when earthquakes triggered sudden floods that drowned entire forests. In 2023, researchers at the University of Arizona used tree ring science to pin down the timing of this event to a 6-month window between the fall of 923 CE and the spring of 924 CE. Even more alarming, the tree ring data showed that a separate fault system on the Olympic Peninsula, the Saddle Mountain Fault, ruptured at essentially the same time. Divers recovered wood samples from lake bottoms using hydraulic chainsaws, and the ring death patterns matched across both locations. What this means is that the 923 earthquake was potentially a composite multi-fault rupture approaching magnitude 7.8, or two closely spaced events of magnitudes 7.5 and 7.3. Either scenario, applied to a modern city, is almost incomprehensible in terms of destruction. But here's where the scientific community made an assumption that the 2026 study has now challenged. After documenting the 923 event, geologists estimated the recurrence interval for the main Seattle fault at greater than 5,000 years. That's a very long time, and from a probability standpoint, it allowed emergency PL anners to focus most of their attention on the Cascadia Subduction Zone offshore, where the clock was already much further along. The logic made sense. The biggest earthquake comes from the biggest fault, so focus your modeling resources there. The problem was that the Seattle fault zone is not a single fault. It's a complex network of interconnected fractures, a primary main fault with multiple secondary structures branching from it and running alongside it. And the secondary faults, the smaller S's, hoarder ones, had been receiving almost no scientific attention. They were well below the minimum fault length threshold used by the National Seismic Hazard Model, the federal government's master tool for calculating earthquake risk across the entire United States. That model sets minimum length requirements for faults to be included in its calculations. Faults shorter than the threshold are excluded on the assumption that they cannot produce earthquakes large enough to matter significantly. The secondary faults of the Seattle fault zone fell below that line, so they were left out of the model, and the model is what drives building codes, insurance rates, emergency planning, public policy. Angster spent years investigating two of these secondary faults: the Lytle Beach Fault, located on Bainbridge Island in Puget Sound, and the Vasa Park Fault, situated near Lake Sammamish, east of Seattle, in the suburbs toward Bellevue. These are what geologists call shallow, south-dipping structures, sitting within what's called the hanging wall of the greater fault system. They're shorter than the primary fault. They don't extend to the surface over long distances. They leave subtle geological signals, making them harder to identify and study. That obscurity is exactly why they'd been overlooked. To read their history, Angster's team pulled out every tool available to modern paleoseismology. They analyzed magnetic data to map subsurface structures invisible from the surface. They used LiDAR, a laser-based mapping technology that strips away the visual interference of trees and vegetation and reveals the raw topography beneath to identify fault scarps, the subtle ridges and steps in the Earth's surface that mark where a fault has previously broken through. They physically excavated trenches across the suspected fault lines, carefully logging the layered soil exposed in the trench walls, looking for the unconformities and displaced sediment layers that are the unmistakable signature of past seismic violence. And they applied geochronology techniques to date precisely when those disruptions occurred. What the trenches revealed was not what they expected. The Lytle Beach Fault showed evidence of two distinct surface-rupturing earthquakes. The older one happened somewhere between roughly 11,140 and 10,130 calibrated years before present, near the end of the last ice age when glaciers were still retreating from the Pacific Northwest landscape. This E. Younger event is the one that changes everything. It occurred after 1663 CE and most likely happened in the early 19th century. Based on further radiocarbon and tree ring analysis of trees that died as a result of the earthquake, researchers narrowed the most probable date to around 1833. The Vasa Park Fault showed similar evidence of independent activity, rupturing separately from the main fault under its own accumulated stress. Let that settle in for a moment. The Hudson's Bay Company was operating in the Pacific Northwest in 1833. American settlement of the region was just beginning. The city of Seattle would not be formally founded until 1851. The ground moved powerfully within living memory of the region's earliest inhabitants, and within what amounts to a geological instant relative to the timeframes scientists typically work with when assessing earthquake hazard. When Angster and his colleagues compiled the full paleoseismic record from the Lytle Beach Fault, the Vasa Park Fault, and previously published data from other secondary faults in the zone, the recurrence interval they calculated was stark: approximately one earthquake every 350 years over the past 2,050 years. Compare that to the main fault's estimated interval of greater than 5,000 years. The secondary faults are rupturing more than 14 times more frequently than the primary fault. And ERD within those 2,500 years of activity, the pattern appears to show that earthquakes have been getting more frequent over time, not less. The surface ruptures of the Seattle fault zone over the past 2,500 years have been dominated by events on these secondary structures, not the main fault. Previous research had already established that at least one of these secondary faults was capable of producing a magnitude 6.7 earthquake, comparable in size to the 2001 Nisqually earthquake that caused extensive damage across the Seattle region. But there's a critical difference. The NE. Nisqually earthquake originated deep underground, approximately 52 kilometers below the surface. A shallow crustal earthquake on the Seattle fault zone's secondary faults would release its energy much closer to the surface, generating far more intense ground shaking in the neighborhoods immediately above it, which happens to include some of the most densely built and populated areas of the entire city. The Nisqually event in February 2001 is worth revisiting as a reference point, because it demonstrated in real time exactly how vulnerable Seattle is, even to earthquakes that originate far away and deep underground. The magnitude 6.8 quake struck near Olympia, roughly 96 kilometers south of Seattle. Even at distance and depth, it caused over $2 billion in damage across the region. In Pioneer Square in the Chinatown International District, unreinforced masonry buildings cracked and shed bricks onto the sidewalks below. The historic Cadillac Hotel sustained damage, severing enough to require years of restoration work. The old elevated Alaskan Way viaduct running along the waterfront suffered structural damage that accelerated the case for replacing it entirely. 31 buildings were red tagged as too unsafe to enter. Over 1,000 more were yellow tagged, meaning restricted entry only. And again, that was a deep earthquake centered nearly 100 kilometers away. Now consider a magnitude 6.7 earthquake rupturing at shallow depth directly beneath downtown Seattle. The physics are not comparable. Peak ground acceleration, the violent jarring force that destroys structures, would be exponentially greater. Duration might be shorter, but the intensity above the fault trace would be catastrophic, and certain neighborhoods would experience additional amplification because of what they're built on. Seattle was constructed on a complex mix of glacial deposits and, in many areas, artificial fill material placed during the aggressive urban development of the late 1800s and early 1900s. The Duwamish Valley, Sodo, Georgetown, South Park, and much of the industrial waterfront were built on top of loose, water-saturated fill. During an earthquake, these soils can undergo a process called liquefaction, in which the shaking causes water pressure within the soil to spike rapidly, and the ground essentially converts from a solid into a liquid. Buildings tilt, roads buckle and fracture, underground infrastructure, water mains, sewer lines, gas pipes, electrical conduits all crack apart. In severe cases, entire structures sink into the ground. Roughly 15% of Seattle's total land area is susceptible to liquefaction, and some of the most vulnerable zones sit directly along the Seattle fault zone trace, precisely where a shallow crustal earthquake would produce the strongest shaking. The building stock above that ground tells its own concerning story. Seattle has cataloged over 1,000 unreinforced masonry structures within its city limits. These are older brick and stone buildings, constructed before the era of mandatory steel reinforcement and yielding codes. In an earthquake, the mortar between the bricks fails, the walls lose structural integrity, and the building can partially or completely collapse. Facades fall onto sidewalks, floors pancake down onto each other. In the 2011 Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand, unreinforced masonry buildings were responsible for the majority of fatalities. More than 22,000 people live or work inside these buildings in Seattle on any given day. The city government's own website states that Seattle has an 86% chance of experiencing a damaging earthquake within the next 50 years. Despite a retrofit program that has been in development for years, the mandatory retrofit ordinance has still not been fully enforced. As of 2026, retrofit compliance remains largely voluntary while the city continues developing the financial support infrastructure needed to mandate it. Hundreds of these buildings remain completely unretrofitted and occupied daily. Then there are the bridges. Seattle's geography forces transportation across dozens of bridges spanning bodies of water, valleys, and rail corridors. The Interstate 90 floating bridges crossing Lake Washington are engineering marvels and simultaneously seismic vulnerabilities. The SR 99 tunnel that replaced the demolished Alaskan Way viaduct was built to modern seismic standards, but its portal structures sit on liquefaction-prone soil. The Port of Seattle, an economic linchpin of the entire region, occupies fill material along the waterfront. A major shallow earthquake would not just damage individual structures, it would sever the transportation arteries that hold the metropolitan area together. Emergency response, fuel distribution, medical supply chains, utility restoration, all of it depends on a road and bridge network that might not survive intact. What Angster's study demands, then, is a fundamental recalibration of how Seattle's earthquake risk is communicated and planned for. The current Federal National Seismic Hazard Model still excludes these secondary faults because they fall below the minimum length threshold. The model was designed to capture the largest pause. Seibel events and shorter faults were assumed incapable of producing earthquakes of significant hazard. The 2026 research directly challenges that assumption. These shorter faults rupture independently. They do not require the main fault to trigger them. They produce their own accumulated stress and release it on their own schedule, and they have been doing so on average once every 350 years throughout all of recorded and paleoseismically reconstructed human history in the Pacific Northwest. Harold Tobin, a geophysicist at the University of Washington and director of the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, reviewed the findings and framed the situation precisely. The massive 1923-style earthquake that uplifted coastlines by 8 meters and sent a local tsunami through Puget Sound appears to be a genuinely rare event. Elizabeth Davis, an earthquake geologist also at the University of Washington, led a companion study published in the journal Geology in 2026. Her team mapped more than 150 marine terraces ero on Puget Sound, studying uplift patterns over the past 11,000 years. They found zero evidence of another 923 scale event in that entire time frame. That's actually useful information. The absolute worst case, the monster rupture, appears to happen perhaps once every 10,000 years or more. The recurrence interval for complete civilizational catastrophe on the main fault is long. But, as Tobin described it, the scenarios that are less severe but still devastating, a magnitude 6.5 to 7.0 shallow earthquake rupturing directly beneath the urban core, are now understood to be more probable than anyone previously calculated. The 17% chance of a magnitude 6.5 or greater shallow crustal earthquake near Seattle within the next 50 years, cited by the Washington State Department of Natural Resources before this study was published, may need upward revisio, and based on the new secondary fault data. Secondary faults rupturing every 350 years, with the most recent confirmed rupture around 1833, means the region is now approximately 193 years into that cycle, not yet at the average interval, not overdue in a strict statistical sense, but well inside the window of realistic possibility within the lifetimes of people living there today. A 2005 scenario model for a magnitude 6.7 earthquake on the Seattle fault zone estimated at least 16,600 deaths and $50 billion in damage. That model was produced before this study, before scientists had confirmed that secondary faults were rupturing this recently, and his frequently, before the evidence pointed to a rupture in 1833 rather than some vague prehistorical period. If that scenario model were recalculated today, incorporating the new paleoseismic data, the numbers would almost certainly look different, and almost certainly look worse. There is good news layered into all of this, and it deserves its own space rather than being buried. The Shake Alert early warning system, operated by the USGS in partnership with state agencies, can now provide between 10 and 90 seconds of advance warning before strong shaking arrives at a given location. That's enough time to drop under a desk, stop a train, or trigger automated systems to protect infrastructure. Evacuation routes for tsunami inundation zones along Puget Sound have been designated. Emergency supply stockpiles have been built up. The Alaskan Way Viaduct is gone, replaced by the SR-99 tunnel. These are genuine improvements, and they represent years of serious investment and effort by engineers, planners, and emergency managers across the region. But the secondary faults of the Seattle fault zone represent a specific and previously underappreciated gap in that preparedness framework, a gap that now has a name, a measurement, and a most recent rupture date. Angster has expressed hope that the research community will continue developing data on these secondary faults to the point where their inclusion in the National Seismic Hazard Model becomes scientifically justified. Updating that model is a years-long process involving scientific review, peer evaluation, public comment, and policy implementation. The faults themselves are not on that schedule. The earth beneath Seattle is under constant compressive stress driven by the ongoing subduction of the Juan de Fuca oceanic plate beneath the North American continental plate at approximately 40 millimeters per year. That compression builds stress across every fault in the system. The main Seattle fault to its secondary structures, to the Tacoma Fault, the Olympia Fault, the Saddle Mountain Fault, and more than a dozen other active shallow fault zones identified between the 47th parallel and the U.S.-Canada border. None of these inland faults have ruptured during the historical era of seismic instrumentation in the Pacific Northwest. Everything known about their behavior comes from paleoseismology, from reading earthquake histories written in soil layers and sediment cores and drowned forests, and the subtle ridges of ancient fault. Scarps. Each new study adds data points. Each new data point refines the probability calculations. And right now in 2026, the probability calculations for a damaging shallow earthquake beneath Seattle are higher than they were just a few years ago, because scientists finally looked closely at the faults they had been walking past. It's worth pausing on why this kind of research is so difficult in the first place, because it explains why it took this long to surface. Unlike the Cascadia Zone, which produces offshore signals and leaves clear coastal evidence, these secondary faults sit directly beneath dense urban development. You can't easily trench through a downtown financial district or a shopping center parking lot. Researchers have to hunt for the rare exposed slopes, lakeshores, and undeveloped patches of land where the geological record is still readable, then pieced together are a story from scattered fragments separated by miles. That's part of why it took until now, with better LiDAR coverage, better dating techniques, and a research team willing to spend years on unglamorous fieldwork for this picture to come into focus. It's not that nobody looked before, it's that nobody had the tools or the reason to look this hard at faults everyone had already decided were too small to matter. The message for 4 million people living in the Puget Sound region is not panic. Panic is not a survival strategy, and it accomplishes nothing constructive. The message is that the threat is more layered and more immediate than the simplifying GIR is not only the catastrophic monster earthquake that reshapes the coastline, it's also the moderate earthquake on the smaller fault that nobody was studying, the one rupturing a couple of kilometers beneath office towers and apartment buildings and century-old brickworry, oozes every few centuries without fail, the one that hits on an ordinary afternoon and collapses structures that were never reinforced to survive it, the one that liquefies the ground beneath industrial neighborhoods and severs the bridges that connect everything else, the one for which the national model has no entry, no probability calculation, no building code adjustment because it was too short to qualify. Scientists did not find a new fault beneath Seattle. They found something harder to process. They found that the faults they already knew about, the ones sitting in plain sight on geological maps, had been doing something far more active, far more recent, and far more hazardous than the hazard model assumed. And while that discovery does not move the ground beneath anyone's feet, it should move every conversation about what that ground is capable of doing next. There's also a broader lesson here for how seismic hazard gets modeled everywhere, not just in Seattle. Cities across the country rely on thresholds like the one that excluded these faults. Length cutoffs, magnitude cutoffs, recurrence assumptions, built on whatever data existed when the model was last updated. Those thresholds aren't arbitrary, but they're not permanent truths either. They're working assumptions built on the best available evidence at the time, and the best available evidence changes as fieldwork like this gets done. Seattle's secondary faults are a case study in what happens when a threshold quietly excludes something that turns out to matter. It's reasonable to wonder what else, in other cities, sits just below a similar line right now, unstudied for the same reasons these faults were unstudied, simply because nobody has yet spent the years in the trenches to find out. The study is published. The data is on the record. The secondary faults of the Seattle Fault Zone are excluded from the National Seismic Hazard Model. The mandatory unreinforced masonry retrofit program in Seattle remains voluntary in practice while the funding framework is assembled. The stress beneath the city continues to build as it has for thousands of years, as it will continue to do. The interval between events on these secondary faults is approximately 350 years. The last confirmed rupture was around 1833. The math does not require geologists to follow. It only requires attention.